Hello and welcome to today's Environment and Energy Leader webinar titled Moving Beyond Metrics, Leveraging Technology to Streamline ESG Data and Impact, sponsored by OneTrust ESG. My name is Jessica Hunt and I'm the Director of Live Events for E&E Leader. First and foremost, thank you to those who are joining us today live, and a big thank you to those who will be watching this on demand. If you aren't on live with us, today's event will be available by Wednesday afternoon. If you are having any technical issues during today's event, please follow the troubleshooting tips at the bottom of your console. If you are still having issues after performing those steps, please feel free to send a message to me via the Q&A widget that is open on your screen. Attendees do have the ability to chat with each other during the event today. You may have to double click on the enter your message for your initial message to go through. Please say hello, tell us where you are joining from, and we hope you enjoy today's event. Please submit questions for our presenter over the next 30 to 40 minutes, as we have set aside a brief amount of time for a Q&A at the end of his presentation. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Sohail Juma today. He is the product manager at OneTrust, and I know everybody is here to listen to him and not to me. So at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Sohail and join you guys to wrap up. Thanks for being here today.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, Jess. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar. As Jess mentioned, I am a product manager at OneTrust under the ESG and Sustainability Cloud, and we'll kind of get into that a little on down the road in the presentation. But before we get started, I just wanted to essentially make sure that during this webinar, I'll go ahead and answer the following questions, and just keeping those in mind as we kind of progress through the presentation. So I know the couple things that are on people's minds are going to be around, as organizations set sustainability goals and start committing to reporting on their ESG progress, how can they essentially streamline and centralize that data capture process? And additionally, what tools can be used for automation so that organizations can focus most of their time on the impact being made within the ESG program and their ESG journey? So I'll aim to answer some of those questions as we move along in this webinar. And to get started, we'll kind of go through a couple different things. One is setting ESG metrics and what it means to do that. Then we'll go ahead and take a look at how to get started on your ESG journey or your ESG program. And then we'll look at how technology can help streamline some of those processes and make your lives much easier when it comes to collecting data, reporting, getting all the things in place when it comes to your ESG data, your ESG impact, and things like that. And then, as Jess mentioned, we'll wrap up with some time for Q&A and just make sure that everyone's voices are heard and all the questions that we can get to are answered respectively. So with that being said, we'll dive into the first topic. So setting ESG metrics. To kind of provide some context, there is a framework out there created by the United Nations called the UN Global Compact Management Model. And what this is essentially a framework that outlines how companies can strategize or get started with their ESG journey today. And if you look on this slide here, you can see that there's 6 distinct steps that people or organizations can follow when it comes to getting started and executing on your ESG journey today. I'll start with the first one. The first is all about what we call, or what the UN calls, the commit step. This is essentially a step, and probably the most important step, where the leadership team from the top down is essentially saying that, hey, we need to become better or become more sustainable or aim towards some sort of outcome as a business. And so they go in and identify or just publicly announce their commitment to whether it's becoming net zero by a certain year, or becoming more well-versed in the diversity, equity, and inclusion part of their organization, and things like that. So being able to commit as a company is a huge first step for organizations to get started along their ESG journey. Once companies have committed, the next step is to then assess where they stand today. So that means understanding where their gaps are as an organization, what risks do they currently have from an ESG perspective, and then align that to different goals, strategies, and policies. So once they've assessed, the next step is to define what they need to do to become more sustainable or to become a more ESG forward organization. So being able to define those goals, have strategies in place, and commit to policies that will allow them to essentially back up what they've committed is essentially what defining means. Then you've got implementation. So the implement step here is all about taking what you've defined in the previous step and putting that into action throughout the company and throughout the value chain of that organization. And what that typically means is you're going to go out and collect the data. And I'll get into a little bit about how that can be done and how companies can get started on that as well. But essentially, you're going to go out, collect the data, make sure that you are collecting the data that you need for your organization and not really anything that fits outside that scope. And then once you have that data, that serves as a baseline. And I'll get to that in a little bit as well. But then you can take that information and start monitoring your impacts and start monitoring your targets or your goals towards what you need to do to fulfill what the organization is asking of you. And then lastly, one of the more important steps as well is, you've committed, you've identified where you need to get started and defined an outcome, and you've implemented the strategies in place and you've collected the data. Now you just have to go in and effectively communicate all the work that you've done in the matter of like a report or a visual or a dashboard or something that you can show your stakeholders, your shareholders, investors, employees, customers, and anyone else who has a take in this organization. To basically show this is what we are doing back when we said we were going to commit to certain goals, and this is how we're communicating our progress today. And so that's kind of the 6 steps that are outlined in the Global Compact Management Model today from the UN. One thing I'd like to point out is that this is something that is not a one and done situation, right? As you start to identify your baseline data and where you stand today, the next couple of steps are going to be key in the perspective of having to continuously bring in that data, having to continuously report that data on a quarterly or annual basis, whether you're a public company or a private company. And so this continuous improvement, this continuous model of being able to update your ESG journey is a evergreen process. It's not something that you just do once and you move on and you check a box. It's not a compliance requirement. It's something that's much more than that. And as we go forward, it's something that you're going to have to think about for your organization, because every organization is different in the sense of what goals they are looking at, how they can improve from an ESG perspective. And so as you kind of go through these 6 steps, you're going to continue to update your program over time and update your journey as you kind of move forward with that program. And so with that being said, the next important step and the other thing to kind of keep in mind is that it's also important to get the buy-in from within your organization across different departments, across different teams. And so what I mean by that is if you look at this slide here, we can see that finance plays a role because they want to be able to measure their ESG performance to understand where cost cutting can be done, where a better use of the revenue can be spent, and essentially where the financial risk is and what they can do to reduce that over a period of time. Marketing plays a role in the sense that, marketing, when you think of marketing, it's all about the branding. It's all about the impact of the organization on the community and stakeholders involved. And so how marketing can get involved is understanding the ESG performance so they can see where improvements can be made in and around their brand. Procurement plays a role. For example, if you're assessing a vendor or a supplier and trying to understand what risks they pose before you onboard them, it's important to identify also where, from an ESG standpoint, those vendors or suppliers are today. Do they have current ESG policies in place? Are they doing things with child slavery or modern slavery? And are those things that they've identified or you've identified? Because if you take on a supplier or a vendor, you're essentially also inheriting some of the risks that come with working with that supplier and vendor as well. And so procurement will play a huge role when it comes to collecting metrics and collecting data as well. Then you've got your sustainability and your ESG leads. Your sustainability and ESG leads are going to be pivotal and critical, and it might even be some of you on the call today. You're going to be responsible for the overall program, the overall ESG journey that your organization undertakes. And so it's going to be important for you to understand where that data resides, how you can collect the data, how you essentially report on that data to stakeholders at the end of the day. And then lastly, the CEO, right? The face of the company, they need to understand how ESG performance adds value, where they can reduce risk, and how they can share that data with the key stakeholders so that on the next board meeting, on the next quarterly earnings call, they can confidently go out to anyone who's listening and say, hey, this is what we're doing to become more ESG friendly. This is what we're doing to become more sustainable. And that way you get the approval and the guidance from everyone across, from customers, employees, stakeholders. So that way everyone is aligned with the communication that is being sent out on behalf of the organization. And taking that even a step further, right? For those of you who might already be on an ESG journey, you can probably tell how complex of a process this is, right? There's so many different departments and teams that are involved that you have to essentially work cross-functionally to get the data, to get the reporting that you need. It's going to be impossible to not go that route. And so everyone from, your HR, right? If you're using an HR system like Workday, that contains very specific data that might relate to the social pillar. And similar like finance and sales and security, everyone has data within the organization that plays a critical role. And it's up to essentially all of us to essentially work with those different teams cross-functionally to identify where that data is. And once you have that data, and once you are at a place where you can start reporting, what's going to happen is you're going to see this result of the company becoming more trusted, right? Once a company is more trusted, it's easier to break that trust, but it's significantly harder to keep building and maintaining that trust. And that trust is something that investors look at. That's something that customers and employees will depend on. If you're not a trusted company, no matter how much you get started on your journey, it's going to be a difficult uphill battle. And so the benefit of starting on an ESG journey, reporting on that data, is that you become a more trusted company overall. And why that matters is essentially why OneTrust exists, right? Because at OneTrust, we essentially believe that what's good for society is good for business. And that's essentially what our purpose is at OneTrust, right? This is why we get up out of bed. This is why we build what we build, to help companies by doing what's good for people and doing what's good for the planet. And by doing that, you become a more trusted company. ESG becomes a kind of a byproduct of that, and vice versa, right? As you begin your ESG journey, you can kind of help the company become more trusted because you're becoming more transparent with the ESG data that people are looking for today. And all of these kind of play a big role out there. And as an example, for what we do at OneTrust, right? We kind of consider ourselves a trust intelligence platform based on things like visibility, automation, and action inside your data. And we break that down into essentially 4 different clouds. You have your privacy and data governance cloud, which is essentially responsible for making sure that the data that you are processing as an organization from your customers or sub-processors are being processed for the right reasons and not for anything more than that. You have your GRC and security assurance cloud to make sure that your controls are in place for certain kinds of data, that you're making sure that you have risks identified and mitigated where needed. You have your ethics and culture cloud, where companies allow their organization to speak up and become more action-oriented. If something doesn't seem right, they feel free to whistleblow where needed. They can speak up where needed as well. And lastly, you have your ESG and sustainability cloud, which I'll kind of dive into, but that's essentially where this topic of conversation will kind of steer us today. All of that is essentially built upon what we call automated intelligence and stakeholder engagement. A lot of the stuff that we do today, and I'm sure a lot of people on the call can attest to, a lot of the problems that we try to solve tend to be very manual in today's world, right? Whether it's Excel spreadsheets plus email plus chats plus back and forth, meetings, all of that can kind of take a toll. And so by automating as many of the processes as we can, we make it so much easier for you to kind of centralize your communication, centralize all the work that has to be done. And all of that allows you to kind of see insights and benchmarking as well, kind of see where you stand today versus where you stood a quarter ago, a year ago, and also potentially comparing yourself with others, peers in your industry today. And so taking a further step into the ESG side of things, right? There's a lot of different problems when it comes to ESG and sustainability that we try to solve, not just at OneTrust, but essentially every company out there. The bread and butter is all about program management, right? This is all about how do you manage the data collection process? How do you manage the reporting and analytics? And how do you essentially come out with a report or a visual to show your organization, to show stakeholders, this is what we're doing to become more ESG friendly. Then you've got carbon accounting, right? A lot of companies don't know how to build a carbon footprint, right? Your carbon footprint is going to play a critical role when you look at how the world can become net zero or carbon neutral, essentially. Being able to do carbon accounting is a very difficult, complex problem based on what comprises carbon accounting. And I'll get to that as well. But carbon accounting is something to also not take lightly at all. If done correctly, it provides a huge amount of insight in where your organization can improve today. And then lastly, kind of something I alluded to before is the ability to essentially understand your supply chain from an ESG perspective, right? You need to manage your supply chain in the sense of, who are the suppliers that I'm working with? What are their risks from an ESG standpoint? And then from an organization perspective, where do I stand in terms of the several ESG rating companies that are out there? And who do I partner with to, shed some more light on my business, on my organization, and my supply chain overall? We do this through things like analysis. So, prioritizing initiatives, which I'll get into, reporting, regulatory platforms. So for a lot of you following what the SEC is doing, for a lot of you following what's out there in the EU and some of the regulatory decisions that are being made out there, there's a lot to take in this ESG market. And it helps to understand what regulatory actions are being driven in this space today. And then lastly, API integrations, right? Everyone wants to be able to automate as much of their journey as possible. API integrations are going to be something we'll talk about in a little bit, and one way that it'll make things much easier from a data collection standpoint. And so, all of that aside, the most important thing, and probably the most common question we get today is, how do we get started, right? For companies that are not as mature in their process today, it can feel like, you have to do a million different things at the same time. And that's not necessarily the case. You just have to understand a couple of different things that I'll lay out here. And that way you can kind of get started on that journey and not have to feel overwhelmed in terms of, the different steps you have to take, where you have to get the data from, how are you going to do the reporting, things like that. So I'll get into that right now. But the first thing I want to call out is it's important to identify who cares within your organization, right? The answer would ideally be everyone within the organization, plus anyone who has a stake in the company. But ideally, you have to focus on your key stakeholders, right? And that can start with something as simple as a materiality assessment. A materiality assessment is essentially a way for organizations to figure out what matters to them as a company. And then that kind of serves as a North Star when it comes to your ESG journey. If you don't have that, you can just simply identify other stakeholders, whether it's the CEO or, the risk manager, any other stakeholder who might have a say in what this ESG report might look like at the end of the day and how your metrics might play a role. Once you've identified your stakeholders, you then have to educate the ones who aren't as aware or don't have as strong of a buy-in attitude with your ESG journey. And so it helps to basically understand why you're doing this in the first place. Why do you have to collect the data? Why do people care about this report that you have to send out? And it also helps if the CEO doesn't have that buy-in. They'll eventually have to have that buy-in based on regulatory actions, based on other things that are going to come up that they might not be aware of. And so getting that CEO buy-in is just as important because that helps spread the buy-in process across the various organizations as well. And by doing that, you're also effectively communicating, what you're doing with your ESG journey across the different stakeholders and identifying where the company can work together and not just be siloed when it comes to collecting that data today. The next thing you want to do is once you've identified your stakeholders, the next important step is to identify what standards and frameworks the business cares about or is being told to care about. Investors might have a better idea of some of these things because in the ESG space today, all of these different standards and frameworks exist, and it's not really uniform, right? It's a very fragmented approach to how you can go out and identify what matters from a reporting perspective. For example, If your priority is to figure out how you can become net zero by 2030 or 2050, maybe you have to follow the greenhouse gas protocol because that outlines the different scopes of emissions and what you have to do to report on your emissions today and what you can do to reduce that over time. If your investors or if someone within the organization is saying, well, we need to put this into our 10K, or we need to present this in our quarterly earnings call, well, then there's things like CDP, TCFD, SASB, and GRI that have a set of their own metrics that you have to go out and collect information on. Some of these might be overlapping, but it's just at the end of the day, a lot of this can be very complex if you don't know where to get started. And so by identifying your stakeholders, identifying the standards and frameworks that you need to work on will help make things significantly easier for your metric collection journey as well. For example, SASB has 77 distinct industries that they've broken their framework into. If you have to report on SASB, that can be a little disjointed. And so by understanding the industries that you play in, the markets that you have to report against, if you do decide to use SASB, for example, you'll be able to just kind of pick and choose which industries relate to you. And then the metrics that pertain to each of those different industry-based frameworks will make it much easier for you to identify which metrics to collect on and where to get started. And again, as I mentioned, once you've identified the framework, the metrics that you need to start collecting against become much easier to identify because each metric has a set of distinct metrics. Sorry, each framework has a set of distinct metrics that you need to collect against. And it might even be specific to your own organization. As I mentioned before, each organization is going to go about their ESG program very differently. They might be told, company A might be told that you have to report on environmental-based metrics. Company B might be told they have to report on GRI for their framework, and company C might be told, well, we need to understand our emissions data today. And so by being able to identify your stakeholders, by being able to identify the frameworks and standards that matter to you as an organization, then you're able to really clamor down on the metrics that you need to start collecting, right? By doing all those things in place, you now have a great idea of what it means to essentially kick off your ESG journey, what it means to begin collecting the data, which I'll also get to after this, and how technology can help make that a little bit easier. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of how you can get started. Identify your stakeholders, understand what standards and frameworks you have to start reporting against, and that can come from the top down, that can come from investors, that can come from what the organization thinks is best to report against. And then once you identify that, you'll have an understanding of what metrics you need to start collecting data against. And that makes things so much easier in a much more streamlined process to get started. So with the framework and with the process in mind, and now with a lighter approach in terms of how you want to get started, now I'll kind of talk into how technology will help make your life significantly easier. So, as I mentioned, there's a framework to all of this, but every framework might differ. So everything I've talked about is one framework and one approach to starting your ESG journey. You might already know what frameworks you need to work on. You might already know what metrics you need to collect. You might already be doing ESG reporting today, but you might need help with certain processes within that framework. And so every company, again, is going to be different. Every process and every journey is going to be different. So it's going to be up to you to identify where you need to get started and how to kick that off. And as I mentioned before, right, conducting a materiality assessment is going to be something that a lot of companies might end up doing, because a materiality assessment just basically identifies what are the top priorities for the company in order to get an ESG reporting off the ground. That involves a lot of different stakeholders basically having their say in terms of, we think waste management matters, or we think, water consumption matters, or we think recycling, or we think DE&I matters. And so being able to identify priorities is going to be one of the first key steps into how technology will help. Once you've done that, for example, in OneTrust, you can create initiatives that basically outline what the results of that materiality assessment were all about. And so you take your materiality assessment results, you basically convert those into initiatives, which from my perspective is essentially a company-wide priority or mandate from an ESG perspective that you can leverage to drive change within your organization. Once you've identified your initiatives and your frameworks, you already have those metrics in place that you need to go and collect. And I'll talk about how you can go and collect those metrics in a little bit. But it's important to understand that your initiatives are going to be what the company cares about at a high level. The metrics are going to be what drives those initiatives in terms of what it is you need to work on as an organization. And some of those are driven through things like workflows. You can create tasks to drive some of that progress as well. And then you can also set goals and targets to track your progress, right? As a simple example of this, let's say that I'm a multinational corporation and I've gone in and let's say SASB is what I'm reporting against, and I've collected my information and I can see a baseline data for where we stand today. And I've noticed that we're not really hiring equally among different ethnic groups. And so maybe an initiative I might put together is increasing diversity in the workplace. So you have that very broad, very high level goal that you want to put together. The next thing you might want to do is, okay, now that we have the metrics, let's associate the metrics with that initiative. So that way you know what metrics to start tracking against. Then you go ahead and create a target, right? So now that you have your baseline, you know what you need to improve. A target is essentially some sort of desired outcome in a future state. So we could say, I want to be able to increase the percentage of Asian Americans that work in this workforce by 10% by the year 2030. So you've effectively created a target on the initiative, and you've associated your metrics to that initiative and to that target. So now you have your foundation in place for what you need to do to drive some of those things. You can use tasks within the platform to basically call out, work with the HR system, or work with HR, or work with the recruiting folks to figure out a way to increase that metric to meet that target. And so that's where all of this starts to come together, all of this starts to take place, and that's how you can identify those organizational goals today. And it's important to train and communicate that with anyone who might have a say in the ESG program today. So now that you've got a high level understanding of what you need to do to get started, what you need to do to set up your program effectively, the next and probably one of the more important steps is the actual data collection for your metrics. There's a couple different ways that can be done. So you've got manually inputting the data. So whether it's in OneTrust or another solution, there should be a way to manually input your information. So if you have data that you're collecting, ad hoc and on the go, then the ability to effectively manually input that makes things a lot easier as well as you start centralizing the repository of data that you have. Within OneTrust specifically, there's something that you can do today where you can select a list of metrics. Let's say, for example, you need to start reporting on environmental metrics from the GRI framework. You can just basically filter all of your metrics that you have today by GRI and by the environmental tag, and then basically delegate that to the individuals within your organization that would have that data for you today. The reason that adds so much value is, and I'm sure a lot of you might be able to attest to this, working out of Excel spreadsheets and having to email people back and forth, having to ping people multiple times to get the data that you need when there's a deadline looming for your report can be very frustrating, can be very stressful. And it's really not something that you should be responsible for. You shouldn't have to chase down people repeatedly to get the data you need for your report. What you should be able to do instead is delegate that responsibility to those individuals. And that's exactly what you can do here is you just select your metrics, delegate who would be responsible for answering and collecting that data. Those individuals would then go in, enter the data that they have for your needs, submit it. And then what will happen is that information that comes from the people that you've delegated the responsibility to will just automatically upload back into the platform. And that way you never have to, leave the platform to chase people down. If you need to drive something, you've got tasks. If you need to gather data, you've got this delegated metric collection process. And that just makes things so much easier from a data collection perspective. And so that's one way of doing it. The next piece you've got is imports. So if you're a more mature organization and you've already collected data to set up your ESG reporting, you can take that information and upload it into the platform today. And essentially what that does is allows you to centrally store all of that information so that you don't have to start from scratch. You can take your existing data, upload it into the platform, and all of the data that you've collected over time will now be available in a single spot. And then you can, again, go back to step one and delegate the responsibility of collecting data to those individuals now that you've got the data in there today. And that can be done on an automated system as well. Now, lastly, and this is the thing that I think is really cool and where we might be headed in the future is, no one likes to do the same thing over and over again, especially if it's manual and it takes a lot of effort. It's just, you could be doing a lot more with your time effectively. So integrations is one thing that we're going to start rolling out as well. Let's say you work in Workday, you have all of your HR data there. You need to basically find a way to take that information and put it into the platform for you to start collecting data on that as well. With integrations, all you have to do is connect Workday to OneTrust, and then all that's happening is on a scheduled basis, whether you need to collect it on a monthly or quarterly or annual basis. That data gets fed from Workday into OneTrust based on how you map your data to the different metrics today. And so that effectively is probably going to be the most essential and most effective way that you can start getting that data and moving forward with your ESG journey. Is just taking the data and having it automatically get uploaded into the tool. And that way you don't even have to worry about importing data. You don't have to worry about sending requests out for confirmation if all you have are all your systems connected to the OneTrust platform today. So again, you've got a couple different ways to get that data collection process going. The way I like to think about this is you've got two buckets or two processes when it comes to your ESG journey. The first bucket is all about data in. The second bucket is all about data out. So data in involves basically the data collection process that we've just gone over here, and how you get that data from different disparate systems into OneTrust, how you get the data into OneTrust, how you collect that data over a period of time in a systematic or automated manner. Then you take that information and in the data out bucket, this is essentially where the reporting piece comes in. This is where you're able to see through the use of analytics and insights where your gaps are, not just at a root level or not just at the global level, but throughout your organization, right? If your organization is in the US, it's in London, it's in Spain, it's in Tokyo, you can see through the data that you pull in where that data is coming from, where your gaps are. So for example, if you see that your scope 1 emissions are extremely high in Tokyo, but not so high in other parts of the world, that effectively is insightful information that you can drive action towards. So now that you have a starting point, you can create another initiative, right? That says reduce carbon 1 emissions in our Tokyo office. And so you could do things like tie a metric to it to start tracking where Tokyo's emissions are over time. You can create targets for the deadline that you want to meet. And then you can drive that through tasks by working with a plant manager or a facility manager at the Tokyo office to figure out what you can do to reduce emissions. And so it all just becomes, as I mentioned at the beginning of the slide, it's a continuous process that you have to work towards in order to become a truly more sustainable or ESG effective organization. And so continuing on the data out process, right? Once you've centralized your data through the different means that we just described, once you've identified the frameworks that you'll be reporting against, we have framework-based reporting available. You have initiatives where you can start tracking progress against that as well. You've got your dashboards available. And then all of that just essentially just leads to better transparency, right? I'm sure a lot of us can attest to the fact that it's really hard to not just get the ESG data, but to showcase that data to the public, because it's really hard to even get that data in the first place. But if you're able to follow that ESG journey that I've laid out, if you're able to collect the data through the various means that I've laid out, getting that transparency through reporting just makes things significantly easier, not just for the organization, but for the stakeholders to really understand where you stand with your ESG journey today. And so, once you have all that information, let's say you've gone through and you've reported that data, essentially, as you begin working towards your supply chain, you start working with other companies and partnerships there might be times where you might be asked something about, what you're doing to become more ESG friendly, what are you doing to become more sustainable? Well, within the OneTrust platform, you can essentially promote your corporate commitments through what we call a trust profile. So just like on LinkedIn, how you have a company page and it outlines all these different aspects about the company, you have what we call a trust profile. So a trust profile essentially is something within only our customer base where you can look for a company and you can kind of see the outline or the profile of that organization from a privacy perspective, from a security perspective, from an ethics perspective, and of course from an ESG and sustainability perspective. And so if you work with a supplier, you see that they're a high risk from an ESG standpoint. Maybe it's worth considering, well, maybe we should either work with them to reduce that, or let's find another supplier. But it's hard to find that information in a single spot unless you know where to look. And so having this trust profile allows you to view company details, certifications, carbon commitments, and documentation that relates to not just your organization, but other organizations as well. And so let's say that you have your own profile. You can publish that profile and do a lot of different things with it, right? As I mentioned, your information is only available with the customer base, so they can kind of see what kind of information they have on the suppliers. You can embed this information on your website. So if you have a sustainability page, if you have an About Us page, you can take all the information that you've gathered from your ESG reporting and post that onto your website page. And companies and people and individuals who go on your website can kind of view that information in real time. And then lastly, you can kind of share that publicly as well. If you have a commitment that you've made, again, going from step one of the compact model, you can kind of showcase the progress that you're making in real time as well. You don't have to necessarily wait for your quarterly earnings call. You don't have to wait for an annual report to come out. And that, again, builds that trust, as I alluded to before. On the flip side, if you are getting a lot of requests from people that you work with to fill out ESG-related information, that can kind of get a little bit mundane too, right? Instead of answering the same questions over and over and over and over again from various stakeholders, suppliers, who else you work with, there's a couple different ways that we make that easier for you too. You can just essentially auto-complete any questionnaire that comes in based on a list of answers that you might have available, right? If you get a lot of questionnaires asking like what your carbon one commitments are or what you're doing to become more diverse in the future, and you see that happening a lot, you can create an answer. And when the questionnaire comes in, that answer gets automatically added to that questionnaire, sent back to whoever sent it. And it just makes your life significantly easier instead of having to copy paste the same thing over and over again. You create a single source of truth with all your different questions and answers. You automate some of those different requests that come in, and you can manage those requests over a period of time as well. And so we've really kind of looked at it from various angles, right? We've looked at it from an organizational standpoint, what you need to do to get started. We've looked at it, well, if you're a supplier, how do you kind of answer the same requests over and over again? And then if you're a stakeholder or an investor, what are the things that they're going to care about? So a lot of these things kind of play overlapping roles. And so as we'll see on the next slide here, let's see if it works. I can't tell. Jess, is this being played right now? The video?
It should be playing. It's playing on my screen.
Okay, perfect. So I'll just kind of go in and talk about what you're seeing here. Let me just go back real quick and start from the beginning. Okay, so you can see here that you've got on the page our platform. You have initiatives that have been built out by this organization. If I click on that initiative, I can see details about that initiative. I can see what metrics are tied to that initiative. And I can start collecting data for the metrics that are tied to that initiative as well. And then I can use things like tasks to basically drive progress on those initiatives over time, right? One of the major pain points is going to be, well, now that we have the data, now that we know what we're collecting again, how do we drive actual change? Doing things like building initiatives, using tasks, collecting the data, all of those things will amount to significant progress being made towards the initiatives that you've built out for your company. And then lastly, you've got a dashboard here that basically shows at a high level where your program stands holistically. And so you can do things like, tailor down what metrics have been collected and what metrics have not been collected. You can see the status of your initiatives. You can see a higher level overlook of the number of initiatives you've started, the number of metrics. And the more important thing to take away from this is that you have a official high level place for you to go in and start understanding where you stand today. You can customize dashboards today to fit the objectives that you're looking for as well, and kind of go from there. And that kind of completes the data out process, as I mentioned. So you've got your dashboards, you've got reporting capabilities as well. And all of that just makes things so much easier for you as the individual managing this on behalf of your program, on behalf of your organization today. And lastly, all this data is good if it's in the platform, but of course, we need to provide a way for you to get that information into your reports today, whether you're a public company and you need to report on your 10Q or your 10K, or you're a private company and you need to report this to your next board meeting for your board of directors. Having all this information is good centrally, but you also have to take it a step further and put that into work over a period of time. And that's what we're trying to do for our clients today, is just making sure that the data that you have is accurate, is up to date, and you can take that data and essentially spit that out into a report for other members and other stakeholders to view and see the progress that you've made as an organization. And I'll close out by saying, there's a lot that goes into an ESG journey, right? You have to identify the stakeholders that care and might have the information that you need from an ESG reporting standpoint. Then you have to understand the metrics that you have to go out and collect. That could be through the frameworks and standards that I've mentioned before. You might even have your own set of metrics that you've been collecting. And we have the ability to import that as well into the platform. But defining metrics are going to be kind of the most important thing, because those are your building blocks for your ESG program. Then you go in and generate that report. That report is something that you can distribute to anyone who might have a say in the organization. And that also effectively ends up allowing you to become more transparent and a more trusted organization. All of that, for what we've discussed, is kind of how I would summarize how you get started, right? For those who haven't gotten started, this is probably a good way to get started. And of course, every company has different initiatives, has different priorities. And so hopefully what I've laid out here is just a general framework for companies to get started, or who have gotten started and don't know what the next steps are. And I hope that I've kind of, answered the questions that I've kind of addressed in the beginning, and kind of going from there. So with that being said, I'll shift over from everything I've discussed into the Q&A. It looks like we've got some time left, and I see some questions coming in. So question number one: what do you see as methods that will be used in the future to implement more effective benchmarking? It's an interesting question. So I think there's two aspects of benchmarking. One is, benchmarking against yourself, and benchmarking against companies. And so from a self-benchmark comparison, so if you're looking at the data from, like, let's say Q4 to Q3 to Q2 to Q1 and seeing trends on that, you'll be able to, depending on the solution that you use, by collecting the data, we'll be able to effectively say, the data that was collected during this reporting period was shown as this. The data that was collected during Q2, Q3, Q4 was this. And you can kind of see like a visual, almost like a line graph that shows where that data is headed, what the trends look like. And if something is on the down low and it should be going up, then what can you do to kind of improve that over time? So that's the self-benchmarking aspect of it. Then you've got the peer-to-peer, or like industry-based benchmarking, where you're kind of trying to see where you stand as opposed to other members in your industry. Now, that's something that we've heard a lot of as well in terms of what companies are looking for. The way that most companies do this today from a benchmarking perspective is you basically have a set of data that outlines the journey that you're on. Then you have the other set of data that, assuming other peers in your industry use the same solution, would also be comparing themselves against. So by having the same set of data within the same platform, you'd be able to see not necessarily what companies are doing well compared to you, but how the industry overall is doing compared to you. Obviously for privacy concerns, it's not ideal to name those companies, But understanding at an aggregate level where other companies within your industry stand today will also be helpful in terms of being able to understand like where you need to work on and some of those things. So hopefully that answers the question there. Question number 2, how is Scope 3 emissions data externally validated? This is really important. So I don't know if everyone is aware of the differences between Scope 1, 2, and 3 as it pertains to carbon emissions. So I'll kind of just start from there and lay out kind of the groundwork there. Within an organization, right, you are more likely than not emitting some sort of carbon in one action or another. And those actions are determined in the basis of 3 different scopes. So you have Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. I'll use an auto manufacturing company as an example. Scope 1 effectively is just all of the direct emissions that you are responsible for emitting. And so as an auto manufacturing plant, that might mean, the actions that I take in my manufacturing plant to assemble a car, right? There's probably emissions that get involved with putting a car together, having the assembly line, and things like that. Scope 2 emissions are essentially emissions that deal with like electricity and use of heat to, create a product or a service. So going back to manufacturing plant, that just means like, how much steam or how much coal or how much electricity was used to power the plant that built those cars from Scope 1. Now, Scope 3 is, in the basis of this question, is probably the most complex thing that I can think of in the ESG market today. Scope 3 essentially means all the indirect emissions that an organization is responsible for. So going back to the auto manufacturing plant, if I've created 20,000 cars and 20,000 cars are at dealerships and people start buying those cars off the dealership lot and start driving it off and, effectively buy or, lease that car, the auto manufacturing company is now responsible for all of the emissions that those individuals driving that car emit. And so you can kind of see, just from an auto manufacturing example with thousands and thousands of cars on the road, how that can kind of be a very complex problem to solve. And so the way that people go about at least validating some of that information is having third-party auditors on board. So as an example, I don't know if anyone has seen Amazon's sustainability report, but at the beginning of their report, they basically say that, the data in this report was audited and confirmed by this organization. I don't remember the exact auditing firm that did their sustainability report validation, but you essentially have like specific auditing companies who specialize in sustainability reports validation, which encompasses things like the Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions and things like that. So just like validating any other kind of like piece of software or cybersecurity or anything like that, there are auditors out there to help validate some of that information. So hopefully that answers that question. Question 3, how can businesses ensure that they are using data capture methodologies that are interoperable with the carbon border adjustments and UNFCCC data gathering? So providing some context there, if I'm not mistaken, carbon border adjustments essentially came out as a way or as a form of like carbon tariffs to begin, punishing, products that are very heavily carbon intensive. So things like cement or certain forms of electricity. The way I would answer this is, if you're looking at carbon specifically, the greenhouse gas protocol that I outlined kind of shows what methodologies and what you can do to start capturing that information and breaking it down on the different scopes and the different scenarios that you might run into when it comes to Scope 3. We have a product today on the Planetly side that allows you to build the carbon footprint. If I go back to a slide real quick to kind of explain that. So you can see, carbon accounting is kind of what I alluded to before. Carbon accounting within OneTrust is based on the GHG protocol. Any organization that is trying to create a carbon footprint will most likely go through the GHG protocol to identify how to gather that data, where that data comes from, and how they can leverage certain processes to collect that information. So to kind of answer that, I would say look at the greenhouse gas protocol and then look at companies or solutions that are using that protocol for their solution or for their product, because carbon accounting, again, is very complex. The way we've set up carbon accounting is based on the GHG protocol. So if you were to use this product, you'd be able to identify, the activities that you do, the amount of emissions that are emitted, and that would, in effect, help become, compliant with the carbon border adjustments and the United Nations framework for climate change for some of those different processes as well. Next question, roughly how long does it take to do a materiality assessment? This is an interesting question because there's a lot of different ways to do materiality assessments. And there's also different methods into how those materiality assessments can be completed, right? So at a high level, a materiality assessment just basically is an exercise among stakeholders within your organization that allows you to identify what matters, what priorities matter most to an organization before they get started on their ESG reporting journey. And so there's been a couple of different ways that this can be done. There's consultants that specialize in this kind of process, but the problem with using consultants is, of course, there's a lot of money that goes into something like this if you go the consultant route, right? I've been told, and I don't know how accurate this is, but I've been told that companies that have used consultants to perform a materiality assessment, one, it takes about 6 months to do that with a consultant, which in my opinion is probably a very long time for someone trying to get started. I don't know who has half a year to kind of like figure out priorities. And then two, it costs 6 figures to get something like that done with no guarantee of, being an effective exercise or being an effective outcome of what you're trying to do. There are solutions out there that do materiality assessments. It effectively just comes down to, in terms of how long it takes, it comes down to, how many stakeholders are you looking to loop in? How many topics are out there that you think the company might care about? And then basically pushing some sort of assessment out there to those individuals to rank those different topics. And then what will happen is once everyone's ranked those different topics, you should be able to see like a visual or like some sort of chart that basically says, most people mentioned that DE&I was a top concern for them, but most people also said, waste management was not as much of a concern. So if you were to do a materiality assessment in that kind of way, that should really reduce the time it takes from, half a year on average, if you go through a consultant, to about, a few weeks or maybe a couple months. So by shaving that amount of time, you basically save all that work, you save all that money by leveraging the same tool that you would use for like ESG program management. You kind of like move forward and essentially you kind of become more efficient on your ESG journey as opposed to kind of leveraging other solutions, if that makes sense. Okay, so next question, tips for a company just starting their ESG journey. It is quite overwhelming. Yeah, I mean, I would attest to that. I would say before I even joined and learned about ESG, when I first got into it, I was just as overwhelmed, and it was very confusing in terms of like, how do you get started? What matters to me? How do I collect the data? And all of these are very valid questions, right? It's very hard for a company to just start out and figure out what they need to do before a certain timeline. One of the things that I was responsible for, at least on the OneTrust side, is we built out a checklist, what we call a getting started checklist, that basically tells people, these are the number of things that you have to do to at least get started on your journey. Now, again, going back to the fact that every company is very different. You might have companies who don't know where to get started. You might have companies who are very mature in their process and just need a way to better report on their data. You might have companies in between that maturity life cycle. And so and I'm assuming this is probably for someone who's less mature, doesn't really know where to begin. So I would say having a checklist is probably the most important thing, right? The things that you have to know go back to identifying your stakeholders, understanding how your organization is built, understanding what frameworks and standards you need to report against. And that's something that, again, differs per company, and something that we'll have to have like an internal discussion to figure out what you or maybe your investors might care about from a reporting standpoint. Once you figure out your frameworks and the standards that you need to report against, then each framework has a list of metrics that you have to start reporting against. And so once you have those metrics, the the main difficulty becomes how do you collect that data, and that again becomes an organizational wide exercise that you have to partake in. And so just to kind of summarize, if you didn't know how to get started, if this was like your first ever session in terms of ESG and things like that, if you don't know anything about ESG, of course, I would say get up to date on ESG. There's a lot of different platforms out there for understanding ESG and what it means. Once you understand ESG, that allows you to get that buy-in from other stakeholders within your organization. Understand who your stakeholders are, understand what frameworks that you need to report against. Once you understand your frameworks, that will eventually lead you to the metrics that you need to start collecting. Once you've collected those metrics, then you have the ability to create that report. So it's just kind of like a couple of different pillars, but then are broken down into a couple of different steps. And I hope that kind of helps answer the question. If not, let me know and I can expand on that as well. Okay, next question. BV Reacu, I'm not familiar with what that is. Okay, from scratch to full implementation, what is a time frame for implementation? So again, I think this is very similar to what we discussed around materiality assessment. I think it's going to come down to once you understand what the company is looking for from a framework, stakeholder reporting perspective, then it just becomes a matter of how you collect that data. So if you're a smaller company, it might be easier to get that data and might take less time. If you're a bigger company, that might take more time because you have to work with different people within your organization as well as maybe outside of your organization, and kind of going from there. So there's not a concrete answer in terms of time frame, but if this is something that's very critical to an organization, it can be done in a matter of potentially months, depending on the size of the organization, and kind of like going from there. But hopefully that framework and those steps kind of provide a North Star in terms of how to get started. And then it's just a matter of the organization executing against those steps. Next step, is there an ISO specific process on how to perform ESG? There is. So I'm trying to remember the names. I think there's ISO 26000 or ISO 14000. But those are the ISO specific frameworks. They're not 100% aligned to like ESG reporting or asking for things that are specific to ESG 100%. But we have gotten some questions around ISO and how ISO plays a role with ESG. And in my perspective, I think there's a lot of overlaps from like the GRC side. So when it comes to things like managing risk to ESG, right? Because they both have a governance factor in them. They both have a risk factor in them. And so ISO does play a role very heavily on the GRC, the risk side of companies. But there's also been some overlap with ESG, and I believe ESG 26,000 and 14,000, I believe are the ones that kind of play a role around like the ESG side of things. Yeah, I think that was all the questions. I know we're just almost at time, but yeah, I just wanted to say thanks to everyone for joining the webinar. Hopefully this was all very informative, and I'm happy to follow up on any other questions or concerns that come after this.
Well, I think this was a great presentation, and I do want to thank the attendees for submitting questions today. If you are watching this on demand, please feel free to submit questions. We will forward them on to the team at OneTrust and make sure that they are in contact with you. I'm going to give Sahil the last word here if he wants to add any big takeaways for attendees. I know you talked about many different aspects of ESG and initiatives and metrics. So I'll give you the floor for another minute or so.
Yeah, I'll conclude by saying this, right? Every organization is different. Every organization has different needs and wants from an ESG journey. The biggest thing that I would say is figure out what you need to do for that ESG journey. Figure out who your stakeholders are, figure out the frameworks that you need to align against, and then figure out the metrics that align with those frameworks. Every framework is publicly available. And so if you decide to do SASB, for example, you'll be able to see on the SASB website the list of metrics that you need to collect. And even if you are doing like internal frameworks that aren't aligned with some of these like more fragmented ones, I think having a goal and working around that goal helps drive a lot of the change within ESG, right? Changing a company is very hard. Getting buy-in is very, very difficult. But if you're able to educate yourself on the ESG side of things, if you're able to understand what the company cares about or what investors are asking for, a lot of this becomes much more easily done. And I think doing that allows you to become more trusted. As I mentioned, doing that allows you to make your job a lot more easier too. So going back to the data in, data out, the data in process is just as important as the data out. And so figure out kind of like that journey, and we'll try to share these slides as well after the webinar. So that way you can kind of refer to those different steps in the journey and kind of take it from there. And hopefully that was very helpful.
Well, thank you. We really appreciate you wrapping it up for us today. And thank you again to those joining us live. And again, this event will be available on demand within the next couple of hours. When you do log back in to watch this as a recap or to download the copy of today's slide deck, please note that the slide deck will be available in the resources section. So again, I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon, morning, wherever you are in the world. And this concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.